I'm always conscious that our education system it's very privileged, and it's very white, it's very middle class, and it can be quite removed from the experiences of most of the world. And so I'm always interested in how students connect what they're learning to bigger social issues, and how they think about, issues of justice and issues of fairness and issues of equity and those kind of things, how they think about what's happening for others and how they take their education and marry the two, rather than assuming it has to be one or the other.
If students can get organised and critically engage an important idea within the university setting, then they have the potential to unsettle the bureaucracy of powerful institutions and have them redirect policy for potentially more equitable outcomes.
So if you think about knowledge as control, curiosity, compassion, it's like, well, what are your motivations for knowledge? I would ask students to think about that. What is your motivation for acquiring knowledge? And what are you going to use this privileged position for? What is poverty? Poverty is when you're convinced you are stupid and useless and surplus, not needed. On one hand, that's how Schumacher defines poverty. The great economist, who wrote "Small is Beautiful." Poverty, I think, is to have no control over decisions that impact on your life and very few options. You're stuck. You can't get out. You see no pathways. And usually you're convinced that's your fault, that you don't have those pathways. Hence, I'm ignorant. So it becomes a psychological trap that emerges from the structural disjunctures that you're immersed in, that you have hopes and aspirations for your life, but there are no opportunities to live those because of structural issues around education and jobs and social capital. You don't have the networks that link you into opportunities. So poverty is a result of all sorts of structural issues that certainly lead people to have very few choices and a deep sense often of their own ignorance. Yeah.
Poverty is poverty. Whether it's here or whether it's abroad, it's poverty.
I think that poverty is a political and economic outcome of inequality.
We tend to make it very complex. It's this, it's that. It's not complex. It's very, very simple. People don't have money and they don't have resources. That's why they're poor. If you give them money and you give them resources, they're no longer poor.
There's no need for poverty. There's no need for our children to be living in hunger and be suffering. The children of the world, there's enough to go around. But it's about sharing what we have with others. But putting all that into policy as well, and governments of the world need to take a stand and come together. And rather than coming together to fight wars, they need to be coming together to fight hunger and fight poverty and put in their resources, because there's no reason for people to suffer.
I actually think the word poverty is a problem. I much prefer the word poverties, as a dynamic sort of multifaceted. Max Neef, the great Chilean economist who wrote a classic book, Human Scale Development, talks about poverties, and that there's economic poverties, but, as I think a lot of us in, societies of overdevelopment and hyperconsumption, we don't experience economic poverty, but there are whole other forms of poverty that people do experience. So I think it's good to think about poverties rather than poverty.
That can also be poverty of spirit too, is what occurs to me. But if you're talking about a kind of a livelihood poverty, I think it's one of our tensions is, where do we put our efforts? Do we concentrate on things that are happening overseas? I think there's a kind of romanticism about what occurs elsewhere. The slums of India or what's happening in Africa, and yet we're also conscious that these are issues in our own communities, these issues of homelessness and poverty.
We've never suffered, I've never really felt hungry, suffered from hunger pains, and not having to look for where my next food is going to come from, and stuff.
in a lot of ways, we in the Anglo-West have become twice or thrice removed from the reality of other societies.
Whenever I hear about students talking about mining or ranting about certain aspects of our consumer culture, I think we need to be really careful and have a good look at how we're living our own lives rather than doing that kind of objectification and distancing. We're sitting here surrounded by the benefits of a capitalist system, the technology we're using, the computer I'm sitting at, the clothing I'm wearing, the books that I'm looking at. All of these things are actually a byproduct of a capitalist system. So I'm actually a beneficiary of a system that's already quite oppressive. So how I can be active and still live with that contradiction is, I think, an ongoing tension.
We don't reflect on kind of how and why we have this particular standard of living. The historical origins of our so-called quality of life, and thus the ability to step out of it, to pursue alternative modes of living.
And if you want to change poverty, then you've got to get to that systemic level, that level of change, and that level of asking the fundamental question, who's the economy for? What's it exist for? You have to ask that fundamental question. Once you answer that, then everything else fits in.
Yeah, I mean, it's the grand delusion of our culture.
Neoliberalism has also become a state of being, and it's facilitating particular forms of governance that are shaping how we understand ourselves, how we act individually, and how we relate to our neighbors and the environment, right? And this is increasingly in terms of individualistic behaviors, maximizing utilitarian benefits, and that, of course, in terms of society and the environment, is probably the least sustainable pathway, and that's like the first and second contradiction of capitalism, and it's now becoming increasingly acute, and yeah, it's pretty scary.
What'll make the biggest change, and I'll stop with this, but what'll make the biggest change is the collapse of the global economy. Once these economies collapse, if the Western economies collapse, that will have a major impact. It'll allow these smaller countries to become self-sufficient again, to begin to produce for themselves what they need, and to do trading on a much smaller basis that's less exploitive.
I think we live in an incredibly unfair world. I think the international political structures are such that make it very, very difficult for a large portion of the world's people to get out of poverty, and small numbers of privileged people in the community and corporations in the community have been bailed out in recent years, and instead we need to be redirecting how we actually organise our systems so that we can create equity across the world. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing. The gap between the hungry and the not hungry is growing, despite the huge resourcing that we put into trying to address things like poverty or food insecurity, which is intimately connected to rates of poverty. We're moving further away from achieving those goals. And I think we have to look at the political structures, the national and political structures that enable those inequities to persist.
For me, it's a question of, as somebody who's privileged, how do I engage with that? And I really like the work of Kathy Jenny, who talks about, because we are resourced, we therefore have a moral implication to become involved, and to recognise that simply in our interaction with others, we're automatically ethically connected to each other. It's not a matter of us and them, it's a matter of recognising how we're already part of the system.
The problem is that it's become in some ways so complex that a lot of people just gave up understanding it. They just assume that other people, they just don't really understand it. There's a sense of not being part of it. There's nothing you can really do. The economy is this juggernaut, and there's really nothing you can do to have an impact on it.
The first thing, I guess, is a consciousness. Are you actually aware of it? And the second thing is, well, is there any sense of having a kind of agency? Because I think these problems are presented as so huge the scale of poverty we're now looking at is so immense. How on earth can I possibly influence that? And so the easier response is to say, well, I won't, I can't. I'll go run my four-wheel drive downtown instead.
I guess I'm kind of one of those John Lennon people where I think that, all of us can live together and, having places where no borders are and sharing all we have, because there's no reason for anyone in the world to be living in poverty or in hunger when we have so much money and so much food that are wasted in the Western countries and stuff. And I think that we need to come together and sit down, have dialogue, talk with one another, and actually learn about the needs of others and support each other. And I think those who are rich in this country and the countries around the world need to give more, need to put a lot more of their riches, to help the poor. But I think everything is a little bit, where we've got, we're spending a lot of money on the military, we're spending money on, movie stars and all this kind of stuff, when we need to be making sure that our children aren't hungry, children of other countries. And I call them our children because it's our responsibility.
As Joanna Macy, she would say, if there can be a changing of hearts and minds amongst the wealthy and enough of a mass movement, then that cultural shift, actually my needs can be satisfied in very different ways. In 1989 I went and lived in a slum in Manila for a month as part of an immersion experience, and that was kind of the beginning of me going, my experience of going, this is how a huge part of the global population live, and wow, sort of changes your perspective. What you see is determined by where you sit, and when you sit in a slum, for more than one day, and you see the world differently, and that sticks with you.
By this you mean the idea of some kind of tent city or kind of slum experience for students here on campus? Is that what you mean?
The idea of setting up a slum on campus.
Tent city is what you're talking about, right? How long would you have this going for? And people would live there for a whole week? Without air conditioning? Will Merlots deliver coffee? And no refrec? I mean, are they going to be allowed to go to the refrec and get a Subway sandwich? This is going to be something horrible for them. I don't know if they'll be able to stand it. You'll have an incredible rate of suicide. Anyway, they'll survive.
I just thought it was a fantastic idea to have an event, a community event on campus that draws awareness to thinking about other parts of the world and the ways in which other people in other parts of the world live. Having an experience that might enable people to have some sort of embodied connection, even for a moment, about what that might be like, may be transformative in terms of where people go and the kind of perspective they have and the kind of work that they do in the future. And if not here, where else is that going to happen? Universities face increasing pressures. We face increasing pressures to meet the demands of the market in a context that's increasingly politically conservative. We have to resist. We have to create alternate spaces. And we've got it so easy in Australia compared to other parts of the world. Australian universities are privileged in terms of the space we have to express opposition, to express dissent.
So it has the potential to facilitate not just communication but dialogue, between different sections of the hierarchy of larger bureaucracies, and I think that's that's really, really important, because I think a lot of us within the tertiary sector in Australia and North America and Europe, I think we sense that there's a disconnect between those who make decision making higher up within the bureaucracy and those who receive the particular orders of those decisions. So it'd be great to find a way to communicate, and I think this is one way of doing that, especially for students and staff.
Well, it's like that old saying that says, walk a day in my moccasins, and then see the world through my eyes. It's like it's about doing that. And, it's like if you walk in the footsteps of a stranger, you'll learn things you never knew, you know what I mean? And I think it's just basically, learning from the others. And so this whole project, that what you're wanting to do, I think is brilliant. I think it's fantastic. To give people just a little glimpse, to scratch the surface of what it's like, for others who are less fortunate than us.
I have a cartoon on my wall there, and it refers to students' activism. In the 1960s we sat in the streets and stopped traffic. In the 1970s we set fire to the Dean's office. In the 1980s we boycotted lectures and disrupted meetings. And in the 1990s we sent a fax. Now that was when I was at university, and I often wonder, well, what will the legacy of students in 2000 be? Is it simply that we're texting, that we've managed to tweet each other? Or is there something more that can be done? Is this actually an opportunity to revive some student activism? That's when you know you've got a good idea, is when you're not the only one kind of getting agitated, when there are others that actually say, yeah, this is something that really bothers me, or yes, I'd like to be involved.